And just in the interest of time, I'm going to get started. And can you hear me through IT person? Am I good? Okay. Form and a legal issue. And so today Katie is here to be my backup in terms of the legal aspects of informed consent, which is really part of her duties as our compliance officer. Privacy officer. Thank you.
Jen has to own the compliance.
Got it. And so today we're really going to be talking more about the ethical side of informed consent. And those kinds of things are really governed more by your professional organization, right? The American Counseling Association or the American Psychological Association, and probably what you learned at some point in maybe a lecture in graduate school. And going into that a little bit more in detail so that you can be thinking about how you can use informed consent as part of your therapeutic process. So the goal for today, I'm going to try to fly through some things because we're already a little short on time, is to increase your understanding of informed consent and talk a little bit more about confidentiality and limits to confidentiality and how you might document some of those things within your chart, as well as how you can use informed consent to be really part of your therapeutic rapport building and increase the efficacy of the treatments that you'll have with your clients. So informed consent initially was something that came out of the Hippocratic Oath that physicians, that we all know about, that physicians take when they become doctors, but also that we think about when we look at our ethical principles that govern each of our professions, so psychologists, counselors, those kinds of things. And so, does this thing work now? But in the 1900s, what has happened is there have been case laws. So there have been some legal cases that have also helped to inform the practices that we have around informed consent. What was that?
Did you flip the switch on
Okay. So there are some legal cases, and the most important ones that you can't see are are ones that really have to do with making sure that clients are informed so that they know what the treatment is going to look like, that they understand the information that's provided. So we can't be giving people who are 6 information at an 8th grade reading level, right? We have to be able to provide informed consent and meet them where they're at. Asking them or giving them time to ask questions through informed consent, and then also making sure that they're aware of all of the different treatment options that are available. Nothing yet? All right, and so what we want to do is think about how informed consent is part of being informed. That's the big word. That it's something that is voluntary. That therapy is something that is rationally entered into. There we go. I had some really great graphics in the other ones too. And it's something that we document. It really respects the autonomy of our clients and makes sure that we give them the opportunity to be consenting to treatment, to saying that they're agreeing to everything that we are planning to do.
Try and clicker one more time once you're ready to switch again. I have it.
Oh.
I switched it.
Oh, okay. So, again, it's a legal obligation, it's an ethical obligation. It can be the foundation of our therapeutic process, something that we talk with clients about to align ourselves with them. And really, it's about protecting them, considering that they may be vulnerable, that they're in a state of not maybe knowing a lot about mental health at the time that they come in to see a therapist, that they're in a vulnerable state, right? That they emotionally may be really struggling, and that we may have to take a lot of time to explain things to them. If they're really depressed, they may also be confused. So we want to really share information with them. It kind of goes back to that picture of what Yoda is saying, is think about them as a vulnerable person and make sure that you're giving them all of the information that they need in order to make a good decision about their treatment. And I guess, we're really talking about parents as well as our clients. In addition, informed consent is something that we provide verbally, but also in writing. And so we want to make sure that they're getting the information that is talked about, not only in the informed consent that's handed to them, filled out by them in the intake process, but also that we as treating clinicians are thinking about what kinds of information verbally do we need to be sharing with them that is not covered in that treatment form. So now if you look at your informed consent form, what we're really talking about is all of the information in bullet point 1. So that's all of the information that, yes, an intake specialist can go over a lot of that information in their initial session. But that when we meet with them, we're going to be starting to talk about things in terms of their treatment that the intake specialist maybe could not provide at that first session because they didn't know if you were going to do interpersonal therapy or cognitive behavioral therapy with this particular client. So we want to be making sure that we are covering all of the information that's provided in that part 1, especially at our first session, our first CE sessions with clients. We want to be talking about the nature and duration of therapy, the risks and benefits of treatment, the limits of confidentiality, fees and payment policies, and third-party involvement throughout the course of therapy, but especially as people are entering into that therapeutic agreement with you in the beginning. So, what does somebody need to know when they're first starting treatment? And I think that this really varies based on the client that's in front of you. Some clients will have seen 7 therapists and you're the 8th person that they've seen. So they're coming into your office with some preconceived notions of what therapy is or what it's been for them in the past. And so what they might need to know is, and what you might need to ask them is, what has therapy looked like for you in the past? And is the therapy I'm providing going to be similar or look different than that? For clients who have never been in therapy before, they really might only know what they've seen on the media, and we all know how accurate we get portrayed in the media, right? So they might not have very accurate information about what therapy actually looks like. So we want to give them an overall structure of what this is going to look like over the duration of treatment. They have a right to know the overall approach that you're going to use and what that's going to entail. So we can use words like, we're going to do CBT or we're going to do DBT, but to somebody who hasn't had treatment experience, they don't really know what that means. So we need to describe that to kids and to families in ways that they can really understand what they're getting into. We're going to be talking about feelings. We're going to be talking about the things that you're doing. We're going to be talking about the way that you're thinking. If you're doing things like exposure or TFCBT, you might be talking about prolonged exposure or narrative therapies and just giving them a general description of what those things are going to look like so that they know at the beginning what they're getting into. I have seen families who, when I start to explain exposure therapy, the parents will say, stop talking about that. She's not going to want to come back if you explain what exposure therapy is. But that's part of my job, is to explain to them exactly what we're going to be doing in the therapy and then helping them to understand how we're going to do it in a way that makes it doable for that particular client. You want to talk about how often someone is going to be seen. So I'll see you every other week or I'll see you on a weekly basis. And my sessions are usually X amount of time. And so for exposure clients, at this time I'm talking about sometimes our sessions, based on how you're responding to the particular exposure of the day, may last longer. Sometimes if you've been in treatment for a really long time, for 8 sessions, our sessions might get shorter as you start to see improvement. So making sure you're kind of giving them at the outset a good idea about how long things are going to last. And then what is your expected treatment course? And of course this varies, right? And we also talk about how this can change a lot. So over the course of therapy, unexpected things can happen, family disruption, transition, change, and explaining to them that this may change how long they're going to be in therapy, but in general, for this particular diagnosis, in kids, we tend to see someone for this length of time. For OCD treatment, the manual is usually 16 to 20 sessions. And of course, This is easier to do when we have manualized therapies and harder to do when we're maybe tackling multiple problems with one client. But clients have a right to know what the expected length of treatment is going to be at the outset, using your best educated guess. They also have the right to know about different treatment options that are available. And that not only involves the different therapies, but also medications. And so we are not prescribers, but we can give them some basic information about what they could expect. Or if we haven't seen improvement in X period of time, that we may refer them along. Does that make sense? We also want to talk about risks and benefits of treatment. So a lot of times we're thinking about what the benefits of treatment are, but we're not necessarily talking to clients about what can go wrong. And we know that sometimes things can go wrong in therapy, and that clients can get worse before they get better. We also think about how treatment is evolving and collaborative, and we talk about how that can change over the course of treatment. That what we begin with may not be what we end with. Any questions about that? All right. I'm curious from you guys, what do you think a child needs to know when they begin therapy? What are some things that you talk to your clients about if they're 6 or 7? Yeah.
There won't be any shots.
That's a good one. Yes.
Not that
Comes
kind
up
of
in
doctor.
intake all the time.
Yeah,
I
Mallory.
think the big thing too at intake when they've never been in therapy and they're little is just that they won't get in trouble for sharing things.
Yeah.
Whether it's about siblings or other family members, and that they won't always necessarily have a parent in the room if they feel comfortable, you know, talking or gathering information with a parent outside too.
Mm-hmm. That's a really good one. Mm-hmm.
Structure of it, that when they come in, I'll ask what's been going on, they'll do the survey, there'll be a time when they're alone, we're going to be doing some techniques, they might have some play time at the
Yeah.
end. If they're, you know, what's going on, they might get a prize.
Right. So some child-friendly language and kind of talking about what might be happening in the sessions. Yeah, Amy.
Limits of confidentiality you can talk about still with little kids.
Yeah,
In a
absolutely.
way that they can understand.
Absolutely. What's some of the language that you use around that?
I think, well, that what we talk about is between you and I, but these are the things that I can't keep a secret.
Yeah.
Like that kind of stuff.
Right, you can't keep a secret. Mm-hmm.
I connected to a teacher, just like a teacher.
Mm-hmm.
Some things that the teachers can't keep secret.
So those are all great examples of ways that we talk with kids in ways that are developmentally appropriate, kind of sharing information about we're not doctors that give, or providers that give shots, that we might be doing some different techniques like playing, that we don't, using words like secrets, right? When we're talking about confidentiality, that's a word that most kids have some good understanding about what that might mean. So we're using language that's developmentally appropriate to talk with them about what therapy will be. We also want to talk with them about how we're going to work with their parents, because especially for our teenage clients, they want to know this information at the front, right? Like, what are you going to tell my parents if I share things with you? And then also setting up a precedent, if you're someone who meets alone with parents, about what that's going to look like, and talking to kids about there are some things that are just for adults to talk about. And so making sure that you're giving them that information and letting them know what kinds of things you're going to share with their parent, maybe even when they're not in their room, So I sometimes talk about like a red light, green light, yellow light system. There are some things that are red lights. Stop. These are things I have to share with your parents. Green lights, these are things that we could go ahead and talk about, and you and I can talk about. I don't necessarily need to talk about them with your parents. And then yellow lights, those are things that we might have to talk about whether or not I'm going to talk about them with your parents or not. Or if not today, that this may be something that we work out together over the course of the next few sessions for how to talk to your parents about this. So it can be really helpful to let them know and set some expectation about what those things may be for you, and for you to have really thought about that. What are my green lights and my yellow lights and my red lights in therapy? also talk about, and I think it's also really helpful to talk about your openness to feedback, using the ACORN, and the purpose of the ACORN, quite frankly. So why are we doing this every single week and how are we measuring outcome? But then also within the ACORN, that those last 4 questions are really a way for us to measure how we are doing together, and that we know that when therapists and clients are working well together, that their clinical outcome is improved. So it's really important that if things aren't going well in therapy, the ACORN provides one way for them to share that information with us. And we also want to talk about our expectations for them for work outside of sessions. So if you're someone who assigns homework, but it's more of a suggestion, right? You want to let them know that. You can't fail in therapy. If you don't finish your homework, then we're going to come back and talk about it. Or if you're someone who feels like if they don't finish it outside of session, when they bring it back, we're going to finish it the next time. Or like in exposure therapy, it is a requirement that they complete their homework every single day outside of session in order to be successful. So you really want to be setting up that expectation. Again, we're informing them and they're consenting and agreeing to the treatment. So you want to let them know at the outset what those expectations are, especially for those therapies where their use of homework outside of session is really going to enhance their clinical outcome. Because we want to inform them at the outset, if you don't do this, we're maybe not going to see the same benefit as somebody who was doing their homework regularly. That's probably true for most therapies. We want to teach them what it means to be a patient. I know a lot of my clients, when they come in and I say, how have you been doing? They say, fine, right? Because that's sort of the colloquial response that we all have when someone asks us that question. And so I use this time as a time to teach them how to be a patient. When I ask you, how are you doing? I want an answer that's maybe different than when grandma or your friend or your teacher asks you that question and we just kind of randomly answer that question. So when I ask you that question, what I'm really wanting to know is what have your emotions been like since I last saw you? What have been some highs and lows? Have you been sad or crying? So really cueing them up to be thinking about how they're going to answer that question to give you the answer that you want. Sometimes I think when we think clients don't have insight, it's because we haven't taught them how to tap into the words that we use in therapy to get at what we're looking for. And so this can really be a time to teach them how to do that. A lot of clients have parents or other people in their life who may not be great role models in terms of talking about emotion or thinking about how behavior and emotion are really connected. So we can use informed consent as a time to say, here is how you're a patient in my office. Here are some things you're going to be learning in terms of how to be thinking about your emotions and how to be connecting your emotions with your mental health and the behaviors that you're displaying. So there's a lot of information that we want to be giving to kids at the outset of treatment in order to help them have a really good therapeutic response. And then what a parent needs to know in therapy is also really important. So at the outset, I talked to parents about how at the beginning of the session, I'm not bringing both parents and kids back in to hear a 15-minute diatribe about all of the negative things that their child has done since I last saw them, right? Which I think a lot of parents sometimes do. It's like the child comes in and kind of gets the riot act about everything that's gone wrong over the last 2 weeks. And so I talk with parents about that can harm a client's self-esteem as well as make them not want to come back, right? That's a pretty negative experience to have. And so I talk with parents about their role as the parent and the disciplinarian and my role as the clinician and the mental health expert. Does that make sense? Also really important at this point to talk about the expectations you might have for parents and the types of changes you might expect them to be making at home in order to see the best outcome for your clients. So here I'm talking about how I see them an hour every week or every other week, but they're with them all the time. And so they may need to be doing some things differently at home in order to implement the suggestions that I have in my office. And so really using that time at the beginning to get parent buy-in to the fact that yes, the client is the identified patient, but the family system is really going to be part of the solution. I also talk a little bit about that risk portion in more detail with parents. So here's where I'm saying things like things might get worse before they get better. You might see an extinction burst or behavioral disruption as the family system is evolving and changing in order to improve a child's mental health. I also talk a little bit about termination from therapy at the beginning of therapy, because I want parents to be thinking about that particular risk, that leaving a therapeutic relationship can be really challenging and hard for some clients, and kind of setting them up for how that may happen at the end of therapy and how we want to prepare for that. And then of course talking about how therapy, that part about therapy can hurt. Therapy is really powerful, and there are so many benefits to being in therapy and good outcomes that we have, but how many clients have we all had that have cried in our office, right? That we've touched on things that have been moments in their life that have been filled with grief or loss or pain or trauma. And so really talking with parents about these are the things that may come up in our sessions, and that it's all to the aim of improving their overall well-being, but that, you know, being really aware that some of those things are risks of going into therapy. And then of course the risk of not getting therapy at all, right? And so we know for particular diagnoses, like OCD for example, 50% of clients who don't receive treatment will end up with severe depression in adulthood. So kind of helping parents to think about, yes, there are these risks, yes, there are these benefits, but also if you do nothing, there's risk to that too, right? So making sure that they have a good understanding of those things. All right. Other things that you want to be talking about are releases of information. So kind of stepping into the confidentiality piece of things here. That for releases of information, you're talking about who you're going to be talking to. And if parents are signing releases of information for grandparents or teachers or schools, and the kinds of information that you might share with those people who releases are signed for. So you'll also want to be making sure to go through those releases of information and think about the boxes that they're checking, so that they really have some idea of the kinds of information that's going to be exchanged when that release is signed.
So if I could just add to that, one of the things I noticed is there's a lot of releases that get handed out at the front desk where they're kind of pre-filled in and everything's checked. So there is no consent process there, you know, unless the therapist takes them back, or the psychiatrist or whomever takes them back and it thoroughly explains why they checked all of that. So it's just one thing that I noticed, that there's like this disconnect at Catalpa, and I don't see it all the time, but it kind of goes in trends, where there wouldn't be a reason to, at that point, disclose all of that information to the school, or all of that information to whatever entity it's for. Sometimes it is, but then there should be a discussion. So if they're in foster care, well, there's probably going to be pretty much all those checked if the child is living there, and you know, and the biological parent signed off on it, it's okay with it. So just that piece of remembering that it's not just about a signature, that's the legal piece. Yes, that's where the state surveyor sees, yep, you got it checked, I see that this person was involved, and that's in there. But with releases of information, that is an agreement saying, I am, as an agency in healthcare, protecting your rights. So I want to protect your privacy, and so let's make an agreement as to what it is that you're releasing, because they have no idea. They just are doing what they think they're supposed to do and signing off most of the time, especially if it's just signed up front. So just some things that I've even looked at. We started talking about that in intake. With things such as like the ADHD evaluations, some of those are really straightforward. That's what they're there for. You need to get I mean, it's a whole discussion that's had. We need to get information from the school. We need to, you know what I mean? It's very straightforward. But in many other situations, there's no consent happening. It's just a signed paper.
Right.
So
for people who are not here, Katie was just talking about the legal obligation to get a release signed versus the ethics of going through the different checkboxes in the release and making sure that you're really informing clients and having a discussion about what information is going to be exchanged rather than just signing off on everything. Talking about court order disclosure in those instances where your records may be subpoenaed or that information becomes part of a legal case. In a medical emergency, that you would disclose information to medical personnel that may come up. That within Catalpa, we have our own internal audits and program evaluations, so there may be times where people are reviewing the charts so people may be reviewing those charts for policies and procedures of the agency that is not necessarily about their treatment, but just to kind of overall check the agency, and that you may also be receiving some supervision or collaboration on the cases, and those would also be times that you would be consulting with other people within the agency about the client and their care. In a life-threatening situation for the patient or someone else, so that's the Tarasoff for someone else, but also if you're ever at some concern for somebody's safety or risk, and then talking about your obligations as a mandated reporter in situations of abuse and neglect. And it can be helpful here to give examples for especially, well, to all clients, but just to make sure that you're kind of giving some examples about what those certain situations could potentially be that would lead you to have to make a report. And then that's also part of the risk of therapy, right, is that knowing that you're having that knowledge that you're a mandated reporter and that these are some of the limits of the confidentiality, the things that they can share with you that you can keep between the two of you in your office, and the things that they can't share with you that will stay just between you. And then now that our notes are no longer sensitive, the information that we have in notes is now shared within the electronic medical record. So there may be times, for instance, where a primary care physician has an appointment with your patient and they're coming in and saying they want antidepressant medication or anti-anxiety medication, and so they may now have access to your notes and look at your notes to review and kind of learn what's been done around treating that. So letting them know that their GI doctor or their all the providers within Epic now will have access to that information in the electronic medical record. And you can use this time if you'd like to say a word about the kinds of information that you document within your progress note. Back.
Other way.
Guardian access to records, so letting minors know that their parent has access to their medical records. And there are exceptions to this, which, Katie, do you want to say anything about?
yeah, I mean, the exceptions are if, because as you know, Annette will kind of send those around to you to approve them. If you have a concern that the legal guardian who's wanting those records could read information and determine that the patient or client could be in harm's way, I mean, that's a discussion that you're going to want to have with your director, and you know, because there are some exceptions there where you guys have a right to protect clients. In most situations, it's fine. We release records constantly, but it does come up. So those are situations to stop and say, hey, I'm having a problem with this, and ask for some help.
Great.
Can I just say one quick thing?
Yeah.
So I've had that happen, and the kid really did not want the record released to his parent, and I documented that in a note, like his feelings about it, even though I didn't have a choice.
Yeah, I think that could be, I mean, document. All of those kinds of things could be helpful. Everyone knows about HIPAA, and at the beginning of treatment here at Catalpa, everyone gets the notice of privacy practices. That is part of the HIPAA requirement. And And so HIPAA is the act that regulates private health information or personal health information that is electronically transmitted. And if you do that for one client within your agency, then every client is now under the auspices of HIPAA. And so of course we're all regulated by HIPAA. And the big thing about this, one of the big things about this is the payment of care, or payment for care. And so what this means is that insurance companies, or if an employee has an employer-funded insurance-based program, that then those agencies will also have access to information like diagnoses and diagnostic billing codes that you're using. And so for some families, that's really important if they're thinking about how their visits are being paid for and what their employer may know or what the insurance companies will have access to. And I think people are really used to HIPAA at this point, so they really don't ask too many questions about it. And again, a lot of that information is covered in the notice of privacy that they're given at the beginning of session, but I think it's just helpful information if they have questions about it to know to direct them either to the NOP or to be able to provide a little bit of information like, yes, they're going to know the diagnosis that we're billing under and the codes that we're using. All right, and then one thing also to be thinking about is progress notes versus psychotherapy notes. And a lot of times people use these terms interchangeably, but they're actually legally two different things. So has everybody heard about this difference before? Okay. So we'll just cover it just briefly, that the progress note is what you have in our electronic medical record. That's the note that you complete at the end of each session. And the psychotherapy note is a note where you can choose, if you would like, to put additional information that is just for you in your office. And Katie, do you want to say anything else more specifically about that? So if you choose to use psychotherapy notes, you're going to want to label a folder and call it psychotherapy note and put it in there. Yeah.
Can you maybe address what like our policy or what we would do if somebody demanded the psychotherapy notes?
Give that one.
They can't. There was one particular incident that happened in the Access Center a couple years ago. But no, we're legally protected. I mean, you can read that anywhere.
We would just say legally I'm not able to, or what would our response be?
And so the question is, what would CATALPA do if someone demanded a psychotherapy note? So maybe I'll just clarify a little bit more. So the progress note is where you have to document the information about like the diagnosis, the duration of treatment, information about like the progress and the treatment plan. Where the psychotherapy note is going to be a place where you might put some information that you don't want other people necessarily within the medical record to know. So times and places where this may be most relevant to you are, let's say if you're doing some form of trauma therapy and a client is disclosing to you details about their trauma that you feel like are important for you to be able to recall, but that you may not want the GI doctor or other people to necessarily know about when that information was disclosed within the privacy of the relationship that you as a therapist have with that client. So you may feel like I need to remember X, Y, or Z detail, but my client may not want everyone to know about that. So you might put something generally and broadly about that trauma in your progress note, but you would use your psychotherapy note to give some additional information that just is for you, right? Or let's say someone discloses in therapy something that becomes, excuse me, a CPS mandated reporting issue. And so you want to put something broadly in the progress note about that, but you don't necessarily want to put the details of that in your note. You could use your psychotherapy note as a place where you could hold that information for yourself should it ever come up that you might need to access or remember the specific details of what was shared with you. And so psychotherapy notes are held to a different legal protection than progress notes, because progress notes are part of a patient's electronic medical record and they can access those things. The psychotherapy notes are part of privacy that we get as therapists to maintain our own records and hold our own information that is not accessible to clients. So we can put our interpretation of situations. So if you are seeing a family and have some working hypotheses or interpretations that you just want to remind yourself to check out and kind of be thinking about, those would be the kinds of things that you could also put into a psychotherapy note. But legally, you have to label this a psychotherapy note. So you have to have the folder with their name on it, and it has to say psychotherapy note somewhere on it. So you can't later on get a subpoena and then write psychotherapy note, and now all that information is protected. It has to be something that you do proactively. Does that make sense? This is not a place where you're holding exposure hierarchies or homework or those kinds of things. It's a place where you're holding specific information that is needed for you for treatment, but that is and relevant to your counseling with that client, but not necessarily something that's appropriate to put into the progress note.
So it's kind of looked at with medical records of business needs. So people can request quite a bit. They can get the financials, they can get all kinds of things that aren't even in the electronic medical record. But things like processing changes within your agency that may have affected your program or something like that, there's no need for that, so people can't access that. So it's kind of, there is quite a bit that people can demand or have to provide, but psychotherapy notes is always protected. So anything that you do clinically related with your assessment, summary of the session, your interventions, you know, those practical things that help you to do your job, you know, those would be things that could be released. But psychotherapy notes are kind of like your thought bubbles and the other experiences that don't necessarily have to be anywhere to explain, you know, what you're doing. So, but yeah, I think it's the labeling piece, and you can write on a folder. It doesn't have to be like an official label off the label machine.
Yeah.
But yeah, probably good just to have a stack in your office so that you can just.
And they have to be locked. So, yep. Once you've created them, they have to be kept in a locked place.
And I would keep them separate from the other clients. Don't just throw a bunch of stuff in the
right.
please.
The thing about psychotherapy notes is that you, as the clinician, can use them if you choose to use them to protect yourself in a legal case. So they are admissible by you in a legal situation should you choose to do that. And that would be something you probably want to check out with our attorney. Katie's got them on speed dial, so you can make use of that. So it's just another way. So this isn't necessarily something you need to go into detail with or even talk about with your clients in informed consent, but just something that you want to be thinking about as you're meeting with that client initially. That, you know, am I going to make a psychotherapy note for this client? Is this something, you know, am I hearing things in my initial sessions that might make me think that I should be looking into doing a psychotherapy note, whether or not you ever end up putting anything in that folder. That note. Yeah.
Do they have to be kept for a certain length of time?
So I combed through the statutes, and I did not find anything that said, and the HIPAA or the COW group, HIPAA COW did not have any information in the state of Wisconsin for how long they need to be kept. So that's actually a question I was hoping to check out with medical records, but I can email you guys and let you know. So the question was, how long do they need to be kept? And there was nothing that I found. Does anybody know anything different? Yeah. All right. So fees and payment, this is also something that gets talked about at the intake session, something that they cover, but something you'll also want to be thinking about, because sometimes this comes up or people ask you questions about this. And they have a right to be informed as soon as possible about information regarding fees and payment options. I often say to families, I think it's healthcare is one of the only industries where you buy something before you actually know what it costs, right? With sometimes the way that insurance companies run, and so that can be really unfortunate, and people want to know what this is going to look like for them when they get the bill. Typically, I would say the best answer is that you want to refer them to Paragon, refer them to the financial policy, and then within the program policies and procedures, there's a billing number And this number, the one in the form in your hand, is the billing number for Paragon, as well as telling them to contact their own insurance company.
Yeah, especially if they're self-pay, there is discounts depending, you know, if you're self-pay or whatnot. So just if you happen to have the fee schedule, I wouldn't just quote them what's on the fee
Yeah.
schedule, because that's not really the bill that they get, even if they're self-pay.
Right.
So it just will confuse them and probably make them panic. So
Yep.
keep it at the billing office and their insurance.
Yep. And then just the additional information that's listed in the informed consent and is gone over in more detail in the policies and procedures is access to emergency services. Thank you, Mallory. Grievance policies, so letting them know that they can contact Jackie, and she's our patient's rights specialist. So if they have concerns about how things are going, I think that that's really reassuring to hear, for patients to hear from us. If you have a grievance or if things aren't going well, here's who you contact. And I think that that can open a door for them to know, like, it's okay to talk to me if things aren't going well, or there's, you know, this access to someone else. We all are hopefully going over appointment cancellations and the CATALPA policy in the first session, as well as what our discharge policies will be. So if you're thinking this is a lot of information to cover in your first session with a client, it's because it is. There is a ton of information that we need to give people at the outset in order to make sure that they are informed about what's going to be happening in therapy. We're looking at clients coming in voluntarily for sessions, and then also thinking about parents coming in voluntarily, that they're not being coerced, of course, unless someone is court mandated, and then that's a different situation. And that they're in a rational state to be consenting to treatment. So if someone is manic, right, and has not taken their medication, or if they are exhibiting psychotic symptoms, you may consider addressing those. You should address those in that session before you necessarily go into informed consent, because they may not be in a mind state to be able to provide rational informed consent to treatment. And then we're doing this as early as possible, but again, in that first session, if you don't feel like they're in a rational state, or they need to process something, or they're hyper aroused, it might not be the time that you do informed consent. You might teach them some breathing techniques or do something like that in your first session, and get to this as early as possible. Or if a client is in crisis, right, and you're thinking, I need to hospitalize them, you're not going to take 40 minutes to go over informed consent and like the whole policy, all the policies and procedures. You're actually going to work on getting them hospitalized and then come back to it at a later time. So do this as soon as possible, but be thinking in your first session is now the time. It's okay to come back to it. Yeah.
A question for Katie and you. A situation that had come up with Emily and I, a client who was a teenager. Client that was a teenager who did not want to sign for consent at the intake. And so I did see them for the CE, and I was able to have her sign for consent. But how long could I have had her come in with her refusing to sign that consent? Mm-hmm. Parents wanting her there, but her saying, no, I'm not going to sign that.
Do we have a policy around that?
We do. So basically at CATALPA, what we have defined as legally being able to see the child as long as a legal guardian signs. Now, you're asking about consent. Well, as we know, sometimes kids, you want me to hold that so you don't have to? Sometimes we know we need to use a little motivational interviewing, we need to build a relationship. Maybe they're super anxious and they think you're just going to make them like fly through the roof by talking about it. So sometimes you do need a little time to get to the point where you can actually have the discussions and they can actually comprehend and they're listening, and then figure out, are they consenting to this? So I think that's part of it. We got to remember, you know, with kids, we do need that time, and we have that luxury as long as, you know, the parent or legal guardian is consenting to, yes, I know you're doing this with my child, I understand what's happening, and I signed. So does that help? So legally you were fine, and then it's just about figuring out, is this person actually going to consent, which may take a few sessions, I'm guessing, from that one. Mm-hmm. So.
What if they're 16 and after a few sessions they still don't want to?
So that becomes a clinical decision, you know. So legally, If the parents consent and are signing, we're saying that's okay, we're allowing that. The law says that's okay, but at the same time, then there becomes that consent issue, and if you're really not feeling it, and they're not, the client is not consenting to what you were able to offer, then it's a clinical issue, so.
And again, I think that's where the ethical piece of things comes up that you might want to consider with parents, that it's been a number of sessions. I haven't been able to get them to engage in counseling, and maybe it's a better decision for us to look at coming back at a time when maybe they've had some opportunity to have conversations at home, those kinds of things, that you might have those conversations with parents as well and make a decision clinically what you think is in the best interest of the client. Sometimes we want clients to be able to leave and be willing to come back before it gets so miserable that then they're turned off to the idea of therapy altogether. So it's that balance. So like I mentioned, this can take a long time, and it can take a great portion of your CE. And so the benefits of this and how we want to be thinking about this, because a lot of times parents, now they've gone through the intake process and here they are and they're like, oh, now we're getting started, right? Fix them, fix them, fix them, or fix me, fix me, fix me. And now we're going to go over policies and procedures, right? But helping people to kind of slow down and understand that the more you know about this treatment, the better informed you are about what we're going to be doing, the better outcomes that you are going to have. And therapists who see this as part of their therapy process and who use this as a way to build rapport do see better outcomes than therapists who don't. And I think we can think of a number of reasons for that, because it can be really collaborative and really respectful of the client to be saying, I have some expertise and some knowledge, and I know some things about mental health treatment, and here are all the different things that I know in terms of treatments that could be effective for you. And now let's work together, me respecting your autonomy to make a choice around this. And I think that when clients feel respected and heard in that way, and they know that you guys are working together to gather this information to put together a good treatment plan that's going to give them a good clinical outcome, that you have a common goal in therapy, something that you're working toward, and set a great foundation for how you can use your treatment plan updates and reviews more effectively as well. A lot of clients are feeling anxious when they come into treatment, and when they feel like they know what's going to happen, what expectations you have for them, and the expectations and the standards that they should hold you to based on what you talk about with them, that can also set up a really great collaborative relationship in the long run. So I know we only have a couple of minutes. I want to just give you guys finally document. So documenting that you've gone over informed consent is something that we want to make sure is in every single chart. So when I used to do my own intakes, I developed this phrase for my CE appointment. So that's why I called it second session. That's my shorthand, .SECSES. You can use this SMART phrase if you want to. And so here, I'm just letting everybody know that I went over informed consent and the policies and procedures, attendance, and other issues that we talk about in informed consent. So please feel free to use this SMART phrase in your documentation if you're going over these things as part of your CE session.
Is that public, or is that just yours?
I believe that it is public. Okay. So I'll double check on that. But yeah, so you guys should be able to use this just to kind of blanket document, and then you'll want to add some things in this. Like, let's say you've talked to the family about CBT and IPT, and they're really looking for a couple of sessions of motivational interviewing and supportive psychotherapy before they jump into either one of those treatments. You could say something about that here. We discussed different treatment options for depression, have agreed to do several sessions of motivational interviewing, and then revisit some of those gold standard treatment options. And why you want to do that is because somebody might say, well, maybe not for motivational interviewing, but someone might wonder, like, why haven't you started? Or insurance company might say, why didn't you start with CBT in that first session, right? And so you want to be able to document if you're doing something that's kind of outside of maybe the standard of treatment. I see kids with feeding disorders, and every once in a while I use a treatment that's actually been clinically indicated for anorexia for a child with ARFID, a feeding disorder. And so I document that here so that I can say, like, discussed gold standard treatment options for avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, and family opted to use family-based therapy for this particular patient. So you want to be documenting anytime you're doing something outside of the norm. And then thank you to the intake specialists who have come up with this cheat sheet. So the first few times that you're getting used to, if you don't already do this, and some of you might already be more of an expert than I am on this, but if you are looking for some way to remember, like, what are the things that I need to be covering, this is the cheat sheet that Mallory and Katie, our intake specialists, put together to remember what needs to be covered through that informed consent.
We also sometimes just hand it to them because the other form is so contracty with me.
Yeah.
So if they want it, I've had people say, yeah, I'll take it. I'm like, okay.
All right. I had some questions, but I knew I was trying to fly. So if you guys want to talk about this more, or you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to send me an email. Thank you.